Hey, it's Jordan. I'm here with Ben Norton, great independent journalist. You're with Grayzone, also host of Moderate Rebels podcast. And I look to you for things that I don't know because my expertise is definitely more domestic than foreign. But I was following your tweets because, frankly, if I'm keeping it real, I haven't followed what's going on in Venezuela. But I do know the U.S., shocker, is now essentially rubber stamping another coup d'etat to insert one of our friendly, brutal dictators. Can you give a Cliff Notes version of what's been going on in Venezuela? Obviously, Abby Martin was there doing great reporting too. But what's been going on and why now are we basically seeing this coup?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. You do great work as well. I'm a mutual admirer. So there's a lot to mention here, and we can do like the brief intro, which I definitely will do in a moment, but I think it's also worth going into the historical context because in a lot of media coverage, of course, like always, they just present current events as if they don't have a historical context, as if they just began out of nowhere. But what's really happening, you hit the nail on the head. The U.S. is rubber stamping a coup. And not just rubber stamping a coup. The Venezuelan foreign minister said it's not just that the U.S. is behind a coup, the U.S. is in front of this coup. The U.S. and its allies, so that would be Canada, so it's not just Donald Trump, the far-right billionaire-in-chief. It's also the Liberal government in Canada, led by Justin Trudeau, who's, this good-looking heartthrob that Liberals love, while he's building oil pipelines in indigenous land, while he's, privatizing the economy, etc. And he's joined Donald Trump in rubber stamping this coup in Venezuela. Also, the right-wing governments in the region, many of whom were pretty recently installed, the most egregious of which is Brazil. Brazil right now has a neo-fascist president, Jair Bolsonaro, who has pledged to kill and exile leftists. He actually said that his biggest problem with the Chilean dictator Pinochet was that Pinochet didn't kill enough people. And this is the new president of Brazil. Of course, he's very good allies with the U.S. He wants to kick China out of Latin America. He wants to destroy all the leftist governments in Latin America, and he's very close with the U.S. and Donald Trump specifically. So these are the people who are legitimizing a political coup inside Venezuela. Now, we should understand one thing. It's a diplomatic coup, there's no question. The U.S. is trying to usurp the legitimate government of Venezuela and replace them with a right-wing opposition that was not elected. Although it's not a military coup because the military has not rebelled against the Venezuelan government. The military is still loyal to the elected president, Nicolas Maduro. So it's important to understand that we shouldn't overstate what's happening. The U.S. is trying to impose a coup, but it can't entirely create facts out of nowhere. The reality is that the opposition in Venezuela is even less popular than Maduro. And we can talk about, Venezuela certainly has economic problems. There's hyperinflation. There's lack of certain goods. It's certainly not perfect. And Maduro does, he has lost popularity and he does have a legitimate opposition. But the opposition taking power is less popular than he is and will likely only further push the country into economic chaos, will privatize state assets. The opposition has made it very clear, and I can talk about who they are and get into the specifics, but just as a general overview, the opposition has released what they call a transition plan. And very clearly in the transition plan, they say they want to impose these neoliberal capitalist policies. They want mass privatization of state-owned assets and state companies, including the oil company. And Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the entire world, more than Saudi Arabia. In addition, the opposition also wants to pursue what they call a free market economy based on property rights and free enterprise. It's the exact line. So we see that although some people in the opposition have tried to portray themselves to these, kinds of credulous Western observers who don't really follow Venezuela as social democratic, in reality they're neoliberal. Like some, Democrats claim to be progressives, but really they just support Wall Street. That's what's happening right now. And it's not about authoritarianism, it's not about democracy, it's about being able to privatize the largest oil reserves in the world, being able to privatize these state-owned assets that the Bolivarian revolution in the past 20 years has nationalized and helped to benefit the majority of the population and not just the oligarchs. That's what's happening. It's a class war.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is basically why the United States wanted to get rid of Castro, to get their oil, and many other dictators. But the thing that's so astounding to me particularly the Democratic Party. I mean, we both know the Republican Party's terrible, but, the Democratic Party for 3 years, I was on the campaign trail, it's like, duck, hide under your desk, the Russian boogeyman's coming for democracy. Yet, crickets. I mean, other than Ro Khanna, I think Ocasio-Cortez, retweeted him. I haven't heard anything from Bernie Sanders even. The Democratic Dick Durbin is out applauding this. I mean, how could you be worried about Russians threatening our holy democracy? Yet you are, as the Democratic Party, essentially saying democracy doesn't matter if it's in our business interests.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, Facebook came out and said openly, the VP of advertisements at Facebook said, yeah, 56% of these supposed Russian ads came out after the election. Only 40% were before, and almost no one saw these ads. But we're supposed to believe that Russia hacked our election with some Facebook ads that no one even saw. Meanwhile, the U.S. is legitimizing actively and helping to lead a political coup in a country south of, it's very close. Russia's on the other side of the planet. Venezuela is very close. It has 32 million people. This is a large country. And this is also not the first coup. In 2002, when Hugo Chavez was elected, the Bush administration also supported a military coup that briefly ousted Hugo Chavez. But Hugo Chavez, who preceded Nicolas Maduro, was so popular that the masses of the Venezuelan people went out into the streets and demanded the restoration of Hugo Chavez, and the military rebelled against the coup regime and reinstalled Hugo Chavez after 2 days. That was back in April 2002. The Bush administration had its hands all over that. Mainstream media outlets have admitted this. The CIA was involved in that plot, as has been the case for decades. The U.S., and specifically the CIA, has supported dozens of military coups, of political coups, of opposition groups throughout Latin America to try to destabilize every leftist government. You mentioned Cuba. Fidel Castro had more assassination attempts on him than any other person in human history. More than 600 assassination attempts. And the CIA did all this really ridiculous things like try to use exploding cigars and poison diving suits. One quick correction. Cuba doesn't really have any oil reserves at all. Venezuela is unique, but Cuba has a lot of other significant natural resources, and even more than that. It's not just about natural resources. Cuba is right, directly south of the U.S., just, very close to Florida. You can just take a boat from Florida, and right in what the U.S. calls its backyard, Cuba showed that they can exercise independence, that they can get out of the U.S. imperialist orbit and sphere of influence. They overthrew a U.S.-backed dictator in 1959, and they still have an independent socialist government, which has still, Cuba has issues, but they still have the best healthcare and the best education in all of Latin America. And what happened is in 1998, Hugo Chavez, who was democratically elected numerous times, we heard Chavez was a dictator in Venezuela. Chavez was repeatedly elected, always. In 1998, he was elected on a socialist platform, and he said, we're going to use the massive oil reserves of our country to benefit the poor and the working class and dark-skinned Venezuelans, because for years, of course, throughout the Cold War, Venezuela was controlled first by military dictatorship, and then when it had an ostensibly democratic government, it was controlled by the elite oligarchs who were white and who used the oil wealth in this, huge country to benefit their own corrupt oligarchs and not the majority of the population. So Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998 and said, we're going to change that. And what's interesting is the Carter Center, which is an election monitoring group that was founded by the former U.S. President Jimmy Carter. They said very clearly they monitored the 1998 and the 2000 elections because Hugo Chavez was elected in 98. In 99, he had a constitutional referendum. They wrote a new constitution. And then he was like, okay, well, we wrote a new constitution, so we have to have a new presidential election. So he was elected again 2 years later, and he also won that election. And the Carter Center monitored both of those elections and said that they were the freest and fairest elections they had ever monitored in the world. Now, the situation has become much more difficult than then, but we need to understand that the enormous gains of the Bolivarian Revolution, which is what Hugo Chavez and Maduro call it, they have made enormous gains, and they were elected. And in the past 20 years, they have cut poverty by not only half, but more than half. They have cut extreme poverty by more than 3 times. They have drastically expanded social programs, education for people who couldn't even read, education for people in the countryside, in the barrios, providing healthcare clinics, and also what the U.S. is really scared about is an independent foreign policy, kicking out the U.S. oil companies like ExxonMobil and saying, no, the oil belongs to us, and we're going to use it not only to benefit our population, but we're going to use it to encourage South-South solidarity, encourage solidarity with other countries in the so-called Third World, in the Global South. So Venezuela played a big part in the creation of what they called the BRICS system, which was Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, BRICS. And they were trying to build an independent financial institution that was independent from the World Bank, independent from the IMF, that they could use to help encourage development outside of the neoliberal Washington Consensus model. And Venezuela really played a big role in encouraging this. You know, Hugo Chavez went to the UN and he called George Bush Satan at the United Nations. That is why the U.S. has been trying to overthrow Venezuela, and that is still the reason why, even after the death of Hugo Chavez.
So basically, Venezuela and countries like it, what they're trying to do, and what Maduro, according to you, is trying to do, it's a grave threat to the corporate capitalist order.
100%. And not only that, not only because of the oil, not only because they kicked out the U.S. oil companies, not only because they have used that wealth to benefit the poor and working classes, but also recently, specifically, Maduro, because of crippling U.S. sanctions, has moved to try to challenge the U.S. petrodollar. And that is even more terrifying because still, in the entire world, basically all oil sales are still done in the U.S. dollar. Even Saudi Arabia, which doesn't use the U.S. dollar, they sell all their oil in the U.S. dollar. And that helps to make sure that the U.S. dollar kind of remains the de facto global currency. Well, the U.S. has been imposing more and more sanctions. They began under Obama, who absurdly declared that Venezuela was a threat to U.S. national security, which is so absurd. There's no evidence of that at all. And in response to those sanctions, the Trump administration ramped them up even further. And John Bolton, the neoconservative national security advisor, declared Venezuela part of the troika of tyranny, along with Cuba and Nicaragua, basically the few remaining leftist governments in the region. And in response to this economic warfare, which you know, Venezuela, there's certainly stuff to criticize about some of the mistakes of the government. It's certainly not perfect. But there's also been a concerted economic warfare led by the rich capitalists in Venezuela because 2/3, almost 3/4 of the economy is still controlled by private capitalists. It's a mixed economy. The state doesn't actually control that much. It controls the natural resources, real estate, and other elements, but not a lot of the economy. And they've been intentionally waging an economic war, and the U.S. sanctions under Trump have made that worse and worse. So in response to that, Maduro said, okay, well, we're not going to do international trade in the U.S. dollar anymore. We're now going to use other currencies, including the euro and, even scarier for the U.S., the Chinese yuan. And recently, Venezuela has been trying to sell its oil and listing its oil prices in the Chinese yuan, which directly challenges the hegemony of the U.S. dollar. So again, this is not about authoritarianism, it's not about democracy. The U.S. has backed numerous military dictatorships throughout the region for decades. The U.S. is currently supporting the most far-right fascist in the region, Jair Bolsonaro, who's extremely authoritarian and wants to restore the military dictatorship. The U.S. and Donald Trump do not care about democracy in Venezuela. They care about the natural resources and the socialist policies that have benefited the people. They want to return the oil companies back to Venezuela, and they want to privatize all of these state assets that were created in the past 20 years.
And, you know, you hear from the U.S. every time they back a coup, well, the elections are rigged. You know, they're not actually democratically elected because they rigged the elections, Maduro and others. And this narrative that the overwhelming majority of the people want insert dictator the United States wants to take down. So where's the fact and the fiction in that? Are the elections rigged there? Because I'm seeing protests in favor. I mean, I'm seeing rallies in favor of Maduro, along with people who want him out. So where does the truth lie?
Well, the reality is, of course, very complex, and it is true that there certainly is opposition to Maduro. I'm not going to pretend like everyone loves him, but that opposition is, of course, often, not entirely, but often on class lines. So middle class and especially upper class Venezuelans, this is still a class society. It's only been 20 years, and it was always an elected government. They didn't, like Cuba, they didn't have a revolution that overthrew the government. In Cuba, they could just institute all these policies because they weren't operating within a parliamentary kind of democratic system. In Venezuela, it's always been electoral based, so they've always been very limited in the reforms that they can create. And the middle and upper class of Venezuela have always been very anti what they call Chavismo, which began with Chavez and has continued with Maduro, and have always tried to pursue a more right-wing, centrist or neoliberal right-wing, or even far-right opposition. And what's interesting is that the opposition has actually been notoriously corrupt, incompetent, and disunited. So one of the main reasons is that the Venezuelan government has held on for so long is because the opposition can't unite, because there are so many different interests. And that's why the U.S. right now has just picked someone and said, okay, this is now the supposed new president. And they picked this young man who's 35 years old named Juan Guaido. Guaido has almost no political experience. He was elected in January, a few weeks ago, the head of the National Assembly. And the National Assembly used to be kind of the Congress in Venezuela. And this is the part that's going to be a little complex, but it's important to understand these details because the corporate media always ignores them and pretends like they don't matter. It's not as complex as it sounds. I'm just going to throw out a few names here. Okay, so let me go back historically. In 2013, Hugo Chavez dies of cancer. And this is after he was elected in 1998, and he won 6 elections and referenda from 1998 until 2013, and then he died. And they had another presidential election in 2013. And Nicolas Maduro, who is from the same party of Hugo Chavez, he wants to continue what he called the Bolivarian Revolution. Nicolas Maduro is a member of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. That's what it's called, the PSUV. And in 2013, he won fair and square the presidential election. Narrowly, it was close, but he won the election. International observers said it was a fair and free election. Very few people disputed it, except the opposition, like always. They're like, this is rigged. No, it was not rigged. It was a fair election. Now, what happened was in 2013, Maduro was elected. In 2014, the price of oil plummeted. And this is one of the limitations of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. There have been mistakes. And in 2014, the price of oil dropped drastically by over 2 times. And that crippled the Venezuelan economy because the model they pursued was, we're going to use the oil wealth to fund all of these social programs to help people. However, that only works when the price of oil is high. And what happened was that the U.S. pressured Saudi Arabia under Obama to overproduce oil, to flood the market with oil. And what that did was it hurt all of the oil-based economies, which included the major U.S. enemies, right? So Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, among other countries. They had major economic crises. And in the case of Venezuela, 95% of Venezuela's exports are oil-based. So this is an economy, 25% of the entire GDP is based on oil. So that was a limitation. That was one of the flaws in what happened, was that they thought they could ride this wave of oil prices, but of course that came crashing down in 2014, and you started having economic problems. And in response to that, the opposition began basically just waging war against Maduro and the Socialist Party that governs Venezuela. And in 2015, because of the economic crisis, the National Assembly, which is the Venezuelan Congress, had elections, and fair and square, the opposition won. We keep hearing Venezuela's a dictatorship. The opposition won those elections and controlled, unlike the U.S., Venezuela has a unicameral Congress. They have one chamber, and it's the National Assembly. The opposition won that, and the opposition group that won it was a coalition group called the MUD, the Democratic Unity Roundtable. And it's very neoliberal and centrist. There's different tendencies within it, but it's neoliberal and centrist, and they want to privatize the economy. They want good relations with the U.S. They want to bring back the oil companies. And there was a young man involved in this group named Juan Guaido. Again, he's 35 now. He was like 32 years old then. And in January of this year, Guaido was elected the head of the National Assembly. But I know this is complex, but I'm going to add one other thing here, which is an important detail that the mainstream media never mentions. So the opposition took control of the Congress in 2015. Then, immediately, the opposition began calling for military coups and calling for the military to rise up against Maduro and to overthrow him. They began basically declaring a kind of war against the president, saying, we control the Congress and now we are waging war against the state. There are some Trump supporters who are like, oh man, the Democratic Party is waging war. No, it's not anything like it. When Nancy Pelosi goes up on TV and calls for the military to overthrow Donald Trump, then we have a similar parallel. That's what was happening in Venezuela. And there began a power struggle. And there was a power struggle between the Supreme Court, which was pro-Chavismo, and the opposition held National Assembly. And they started kind of waging a political war. And the National Assembly started ignoring Supreme Court orders.
Jesus.
So imagine the U.S. Supreme Court makes a decision, and then the Congress that's controlled by Republicans is like, yeah, we're not going to follow that. We're just going to do what we want. And that's what happened. So there became this political conflict. And then in 2017, there were a series of violent protests. Not all the protests were violent. Some of them were peaceful. But there were also extremely violent protests in which the far-right elements of the opposition were burning multiple Chavistas alive and targeting specifically dark-skinned and black Chavistas. And some of the opposition is very racist, like the Republicans, because poor, dark-skinned Venezuelans tend to support Maduro and Chavez, and light-skinned, wealthy Venezuelans tend to support the right-wing opposition. And specifically, not only were they targeting Chavistas, they were looting and burning down government buildings and party buildings. There was mass violence. There was also these things called the guarimbas, where the opposition would go out in the street and then just set stuff on fire and make these big barricades in the street to prevent people to cripple the country and prevent people from going on the streets. So basically, they're just trying to shut down the entire country to destabilize everything, which is also what happened in Nicaragua in this past year. And then finally, it culminated in June 2017. A police agent named Oscar Perez, who was lauded in the U.S. media as the Venezuelan James Bond, who was this far-right Christian extremist, hijacked a military helicopter in Venezuela. And then he flew to the Supreme Court, and he attacked the Supreme Court with grenades.
Jesus
So
Christ.
we keep hearing Venezuela as a dictatorship. Can you imagine what would happen in the U.S.? I mean, people have nonviolent protests and cops beat them up in the U.S. Imagine if people were setting things on fire in the streets, shooting and bombing police officers, which they've been doing in Venezuela. And then, I'm not sympathetic to cops in general, but they're bombing police officers regularly. And then they hijack a helicopter and attack the Supreme Court with grenades. If that happened in the U.S., Trump would declare martial law. But instead, a month after that, in July 2017, as an attempt to try to stop the violence and to bring people together, the President Maduro announced the election of what he called a Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly was supposed to be this body that would write a new constitution and bring the opposition and everyone together as like in this new elected body, a kind of direct democracy. Well, the opposition decided they're going to boycott that election, and they did. They refused to vote for the Constituent Assembly because again and again and again, the opposition has shown that they would rather have a military coup and U.S. military intervention rather than participate in the democratic process because they know that they're less popular than Maduro. Even though Maduro, again, is not very popular, he still has a support base.
I think they're at 70% disapproval, the opposition.
Yeah, well, a recent poll from this group called Data Analysis, which is a pro-opposition polling firm, they acknowledged that Maduro's approval rating is somewhere around 30% or so. The National Assembly is like 25%. So I'm not going to pretend like Maduro is super popular because there are major problems, but the opposition is less popular. And what's interesting is that they have repeatedly refused to participate in these processes. So in 2017, when they had an election for the Constituent Assembly, the opposition said that doesn't matter and it's void and refused to acknowledge the election. And then what they started trying to do is trying to run a parallel Congress inside Venezuela. They said, we no longer recognize Maduro as our legitimate president. And we said, we are now the legitimate government. And in 2018, last year, in May, there was a presidential election. So this is another, again, I know this is complex, but in Venezuela, when a president is elected, they're 6-year terms. And Maduro was elected in 2013 when Hugo Chavez died. That means his term was supposed to go until 2019. Free and fair election. Well, in response to the unrest in 2017, Maduro, as a concession, said, okay, because the opposition said they wanted early elections, which is a way of really just removing him from office undemocratically and installing the opposition. And he said, okay, fine, we can have early elections next year in 2018. And he voluntarily cut a year off his own term and had elections in 2018. We keep hearing he's a dictator. Well, what happened was, in May of last year, there were Democratic presidential elections, and the opposition again boycotted the election. Not all the opposition, some people participated, but the majority of the opposition, the mainstream, boycotted the presidential election. And then they said, Maduro is not a legitimate leader because he didn't win a fair election. Well, yeah, it was a fair election. You didn't participate.
Right.
What is he supposed to do?
Right.
They want to try to use any tactic they can to force him to resign. So then he said, okay, fine, I'm the president, I won the election. And they said, we don't recognize you. And the Constituent Assembly, which they refused to participate in, and the National Assembly, which the opposition controls, they started waging a war against each other. And they said that they don't recognize each other's legitimacy anymore. So what happened was that the National Assembly said, the president of the National Assembly, which is this young guy, Juan Guaido, he is now the interim president of the government of Venezuela. And they just try to recognize him as that. So I know that was like a long explanation, but it's important to spell that out because the media never gives that context. Instead, they portray it as the dictatorial Maduro regime is trying to crush the opposition. The reality is that although certainly the government has made mistakes, and he's not perfect at all, the opposition at every turn, backed by the U.S., all these groups are, neoliberal. Some are far right, some are more centrist, but they're all neoliberal. Some of them have direct ties to the U.S. State Department and regularly meet with Mike Pence and all these people and Bolton. At every turn, they have not shown an interest in democracy. It's not about democracy. They don't want to participate in these democratic institutions. They just want a return to the right-wing oligarchs in control.
Wow. You're like an encyclopedia. Thank you for the history. Real quick, is there a chance we hear 10% of that on a Democratic presidential debate stage?
No, I mean, there's a 0% chance. To be a little fair, she has weaknesses, but I think Tulsi Gabbard, she has grown a lot. Certainly in the past, she had really bad views, and she's fortunately apologized for many of those views. But she and Ro Khanna, who's not running for president, but Tulsi Gabbard and Ro Khanna have really, it's good of them. They've kind of taken the anti-interventionist mantle for themselves and have boasted of their foreign policy cred, and I think they're actually quite good. Ro Khanna, as you mentioned, has been one of the few Democrats to speak out about this. And I think Tulsi Gabbard, if you look at her views on Syria and Libya, she's been, really consistent. And I think my impression is that she probably just doesn't know that much about what's happening in Venezuela, and she's still educating herself. But if you asked me that question 4 years ago, I would say not only is there a 0% chance, hell will freeze over before it ever happens. Now, I actually think that there has been this opening where you have some progressive Democrats who are finally speaking out against regime change wars, U.S. imperialism, perpetual state of war in this country. And I think, although she certainly has issues, and we don't have time to get into that, I think Tulsi Gabbard could be one of those people who on, the debate stage during a primary debate can actually bring up some of these issues for the first time. And that's good because, I support Bernie as well, and that will help push Bernie to the left in foreign policy. And, I'm a critical supporter of Bernie. Bernie has issues, and unfortunately, one of his weakest issues has always been foreign policy. So I think the fact that people like Tulsi and Ro Khanna are making this a bigger priority can help push Bernie and Elizabeth Warren and others to the left and force them to take foreign policy more seriously.
Great. Thank you for explaining this. You could definitely hear Ben, Moderate Rebels, also read his work at Grayzone. And I have a feeling we'll be in touch because this isn't the last coup.
Absolutely. I mean, sorry for bloviating and ranting there, but
no.
Thank you for giving me a platform to talk about that historical context, because the corporate media, not only do they silence these perspectives, but they always have to have things in little 2-minute sound bites, which means you're not able to get the important historical context needed to understand these crucial issues. So thanks, man. That was really good, and keep up the awesome work.
Yeah, and I think hell will definitely freeze over before you're on CNN talking about this, even for 2 seconds. So thanks again.
Yeah. Talk to you soon.